Welcome to your Chapter 15 Part 2 video. This is largely on the different ways that we as humans use water and some of the impacts that those uses have on our natural ecosystem. Alright, your first question says, name 3 ways that humans are impacting freshwater sources. On the surface, we can dam river flows. We'll discuss how that changes the course of a river. We change the course of the river, or more importantly, we keep the courses of the river where they are. Remember, we talked about before meandering and how rivers change course naturally. And then just overuse. We deplete surface and groundwater. And you're going to find that the impacts are far beyond we're just running out of water. And remember that we only have a fraction of water on this planet that is both fresh and readily available to us. So anything that we do that impacts those resources quicker than they can replenish is going to be a problem for us. Alright, list 3 general categories for water use. That's agriculture, industry, and residential. Break down the 3 categories globally by percentage and be able to make adjustments to these percentages depending on the category of nation and the biome that is present in a particular area. Alright, almost all water use globally is used for agriculture, the growing of food. And as we're going to see in the agriculture unit that's coming up later on, a large reason for that is that we're not using water right when we go to grow food. The next largest category is industry at 20%. It's probably surprising to most people that residential use, which is us, it's also labeled municipal use, and municipal means just a city. So just individual use is only about 10%. This breakdown lets us know where to focus conservation efforts. So you can see from this impacting the way that commercial farming and smaller farming conglomerates, I guess, or even individual farmers in different areas, how they use water is probably the place to focus most of our efforts. The reason that this varies from country to country is that if you go somewhere where it is a desert biome, residential use oftentimes goes up and agricultural use goes down because there's not a lot of water around, so they are naturally more conservative with it in terms of how they grow their food. And then also in industrial areas where agriculture is very efficient, you'll see that industry use goes up where agricultural use goes down. But just be familiar with this one overall. Contrast consumptive and non-consumptive water uses. Consumptive water uses are where the water doesn't immediately go back to its source, things like farming, industry, and residential uses. The water cycle still goes on, but there are a lot of different steps that have to occur before the water re-enters the water cycle. Like if you drink water, we gotta wait for the water to either be eliminated from your body or for you to die for it to come out. Non-consumptive uses are things like a hydroelectric dam, where the water is used for the creation of electricity and then immediately put back into its source. The majority of water usage is non-consumptive. Alright, the first thing we're going to talk about is dams. 4 reasons to build a dam. Prevent floods, because that's just a wall keeping the water from going where it normally is supposed to go. Provide drinking water, facilitate irrigation. There, you need to understand how this works. Basically, put a wall in the river and you stop it. Behind the wall, because of the flow of the water, a large pool of water forms called a reservoir. So that means downstream there's no flooding, and then that reservoir of water can be easily pumped out to use for things like drinking water and to facilitate irrigation. Irrigation means the watering of plants, not just crops, but things like lawns. And then generate electricity. You don't need to know the details of this quite yet. Just understand that electricity is not extracted from water. It causes something to turn, which in turn creates electricity. You don't need to memorize quite yet that you turn a turbine to turn a generator to create electricity. Just realize that it is the movement of the water that is then translated into electricity down the line of a certain process. Okay, the largest dam in the world is the Three Gorges Dam. It is spans the Yangtze River. I believe I talked about this before. Let me go ahead and take a look at something here. So if you're watching this, just give me a second to take a look at this. All right. All right. So Yangtze River is in China. Three Gorges Dam is the largest in the world. It is 1.3 miles across. So if you run a 10-minute mile, it's going to be a little over 10 minutes for you to cross it if you're running. Benefits to this: produces a lot of electricity, holds back the Yangtze River so there's no flooding downstream, and then it allows cargo carrying ships to go through because it builds up the height of the water so that ships can make it down at least this far in the river. Okay, downside: over 1 million people are upstream or displaced. That huge reservoir basically fills on top of people's old lands. It ended up submerging historical sites and then also habitat. Sediment flow is blocked, so stuff downstream ended up not being able to do their thing, unfortunately. And by do their thing, I mean that sediment was depended upon by plants downstream in order to grow. This isn't in your book, but it was built over a seismic fault, so if there's an earthquake, the dam is going to crack open and there's going to be a massive wall of water that's going to make its way back to where it originally flowed. Let's see, pollutants are trapped in the reservoir. They can build up there, and if that's a source of drinking water, that can kind of be a problem. And then organic matter is also trapped behind the dam, encouraging bacteria to grow in the reservoir. Also, when it rots, it releases something called methane, CH4. We talked about this briefly before. Anaerobic, which means without oxygen, decomp occurs behind the wall, and that's a greenhouse gas. You don't know what it is quite yet, but it does contribute to climate change. So just be aware that when you block a river flow and you're trying to control flooding downstream, that's awesome, but that means you're flooding upstream behind the dam. That also means that stuff that's supposed to go downstream, like things like sediment and organic matter, and also fish who are trying to migrate, they can't do it anymore. All right, dam impacts on page 420. I'm only going to talk about this for a second because you can read. Pros are, again, the creation of reservoirs, recreational opportunities. Don't forget that. Lots of boating and jet skiing and whatnot goes on in those essentially man-made lakes. You have electricity that has no emissions in the making of it, so there's nothing that you have to burn to make electricity there. Now, of course, if you're blocking sediment and organic matter and that's decomposing, that is creating some emissions, but the creation of electricity itself is not creating emissions. Flood control, downstream, water available for crops, especially in arid regions. The word arid means desert-like, not a true desert, but desert-ish. Cons are an extreme change into the surrounding ecosystem. Low areas are flooded upstream behind the dam, and then areas downstream dry out. You're essentially changing where the water is. Sometimes floods are necessary. Certain organisms depend on those floods every year. Migrating fish can't go where they need to go, displacing people. We already talked about the sediment and the organic building up on the reservoir side. So, when dams are removed, riparian ecosystems are restored, fisheries come back, you can fly fish and raft again, and fish can migrate. And here you can see a before and after of just 10 years of removing a dam. We have gone back to its natural state. Please remember, before people start messing with stuff, everything is where it is for a reason. Time and time again, we find that when people mess with large systems like rivers like the Everglades, we find out down the line almost inevitably, oops, we caused a bigger problem than what we were trying to solve. Dikes and levees, what is their purpose? They control flooding so it doesn't impact human constructs like farms and homes. What can happen if they break? Like New Orleans levees after Hurricane Katrina, the water goes back to where it belongs, flooding human constructs like farms and homes. The flooding is worse than it would be normally because when they break, the water is already higher than it's ever was ever during its natural time, and it's under a lot more pressure. Again, we saw this happen disastrously during Hurricane Katrina. You can see here that the levees broke and these houses are completely underwater. Let's see. Explain in general how the Colorado River Diversion Project impacts the flow of the Colorado River. There are many, many diversions, dams, and canals that practically keep the river from reaching its mouth. Include examples of diversion points in your explanation. Your book has a really nice picture, but this includes things like the Colorado River Aqueduct, the Hoover Dam, the Delta at the Gulf of California, no longer contains high levels of biodiversity and can no longer act as a fish nursery. So here is another pictogram of the ways that California alone is taking water out of the California River. Aqueducts are above ground systems that carry water to different places, by the way. Here is an example of the consequences of what's called overdrafting. This is a banking term. Overdrafting is when you spend more money from your checking account than you have in your checking account, you pay a penalty. And here's the penalty that has occurred in 3 years. You have from 2011 to 2014. This lake, which was a man-made reservoir, gone, completely gone. We've been overusing that river. Things like climate change have been decreasing the amount of snowmelt that's been going into the Colorado River, so those two things have led to the severe drought that's going on in California at present. Let's see. Where is the Aral Sea located? That's in Central Asia. It touches two countries called Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. I will not ask you that. You just need to know it's in Central Asia. What has happened to it over the past 50 years? Two major rivers that fed the sea were diverted by the Soviet Union to grow cotton. The sea shrank. It became saltier. When the sea shrank, that means it became more concentrated. There was less fresh water flowing into the sea, so the water that was left was saltier. So first thing is, fish died because it gets too salty for them. Fishing jobs gone. The once dry land that got irrigated constantly with that water that was being pulled out became waterlogged and something called salinized. You're going to learn about how it is that you can end up with a salty piece of land from using fresh water a little bit later. Just realize that overuse of water also basically destroys the land that you are constantly irrigating. And then dried up parts of the lake are now vulnerable to blowing away because they're dry, and so that carries salt and pesticides to other parts of the country. Why has this happened? Again, diversion of fresh water before it reached the sea. What are the economic and environmental impacts of this disaster? You need to be able to answer those two separate questions. So economic would be things like fishing jobs gone, people's health being impacted by the airborne salt and pesticides that are carried to other places from the dried up parts of the lake. And then also ecological loss of habitat is a huge one. And then anywhere that the salt and the pesticides goes, it kills whatever it is, wherever it builds up. And then also climate changes. When you don't have that water around anymore, temperatures fluctuate in a greater fashion. They're starting to do restoration efforts, but it's kind of a little too late. So you can see where the Aral State is here in the the Aral Sea here in the picture that's in the right-hand side of the slide. And you can see the two rivers that feed into it. Both of those were essentially kept from going into the Aral Sea. And you can see over the course of just a few decades, you've gone from a very robust marine ecosystem. The word marine means saltwater, by the way, to, you know, almost completely gone. These white areas are places where you have high levels of salinity. And then here's what it is in 2014, that it's practically gone at this point. So this is one of those places that you need to know. Okay, let's see. Skip the subsection labeled inefficient irrigation wastes water. What can happen to coastal aquifers if they are overused? It's called saltwater intrusion. Your book doesn't refer to it by those exact terms. It says that saltwater comes in to the aquifer. This happens when the pressure of freshwater aquifers drops due to overuse, so saltwater can flow into it. So, if you have an aquifer and it's butted up against a saltwater area over here, the pressure of the aquifer, so all that water that's jammed in there, that pressure essentially keeps the saltwater out. When you suck out the fresh water, the pressure goes down, and then when you suck up the fresh water, the pressure goes down. Salt water then can intrude into the freshwater aquifer, as you can see here in this illustration. When the aquifer becomes salty, it is tainted for, in our lives, pretty much almost forever. And it is no longer a place that you can get fresh water from anymore, because even as it is being recharged, you still have that salt in there, and what you're pulling up is now salty. You also cannot use it then for irrigation. Salt water kills plants. Alright, here's another picture of what happens with saltwater intrusion into a freshwater aquifer. Dude, if you have saltwater intrusion from the ocean, it means this can only occur in coastal aquifers. Places like the Ogallala Aquifer in the middle of the United States is not going to undergo saltwater intrusion because it's not near salt water. Okay, we already talked about skipping that section. Alright, and let's see what's next. Name 2 things that can happen to the land over a depleted aquifer. A specific term for one of these results would be given in class. The specific term for one is called subsidence. Your book refers to that when the aquifer compresses without water to keep it stable. Okay, back up a second. Think about that aquifer again as having lots and lots of little holes or pores that the water is in. You pull all the water out of there, and now there's just air, and there's nothing keeping those little pores open. So you start building stuff on top of this, and it's like you're building stuff on top of a sponge. And eventually what happens is it compresses. And when it compresses, as you can see here in the pictures on the upper left and the lower middle part, I don't know if you can see these towers tilting, you have subsidence. The ground sinks and everything above it buckles and tilts to the side. In places like Mexico City, that city has sunk over 33 feet because they have overused their aquifer and they have compressed it. Now remember, if you've compressed an aquifer, you can't recharge it because the pores are gone. You've essentially destroyed that aquifer and you cannot use it again. The other thing that can happen is sinkholes, and this is where the land underneath of a structure compresses all of a sudden, creating a hole. And we have this happen a lot here in Florida because the porousness under our surface land, the pores are really big. And so this happens all the time. We are going to talk about something called karst topography in class, not something that you are responsible for right now. And again, remember, once these pores collapse, the aquifer's gone. Alright, identify 2 impacts to freshwater ecosystems that occur when aquifers are depleted. The wetlands above the aquifers dry up, meaning that biodiversity disappears. And then also, second, migratory birds have no place to stop and refuel. The same is true for, excuse me, an oasis in the desert. Okay, here you see migratory birds. Every single year they depend on certain places to be full of water, which means they're full of food, whether it's fish or plants. Aquifers dry up, these things go away, the birds go to land and they're like, what the? And there's nothing that's there. If you're flying hundreds and hundreds of miles and you're depending upon a stop in order to refuel, birds can die this way if they don't have an ability to refuel right when they need it. And again, the same is true of an oasis. An oasis is a place that water bubbles up in the desert, and if these things go away, then the ecosystem that's around it also goes away, and then any organism that depends upon these things as they trek through the desert to get from one place to the next, they also suffer. How does the damming of a river in one country impact another country? Rivers flow through many countries, so when one country dams a river, all the countries downstream have less water. Countries that have the mouth of the river, like in Egypt, this is called a delta because it fans out and creates a triangle-shaped area. They suffer more because they no longer have access to the fertility of sediment that flows downstream, and that kills the biodiversity of the area as well. So farming goes away, and then any organisms that depended upon the plants that would grow in those fertile areas also go away. Describe which of the countries surrounding a dam feel the greatest impact from the dam. It would be those downstream. For example, the countries associated with the Nile River. Here in this part of Africa, wars have been fought and dams have been blown up because of water control and sediment control. If you see here these 6 dams that have been built, Egypt kind of gets the raw end of this deal, as do these other middle countries, and on regular occasion the dams are blown up by other countries. And you can see here the source is Lake Victoria, and then it flows all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea. And if you look at this entire area and you understand that Sahara Desert cuts through here, this is the only source of water that's fresh and readily available in the entire region. So again, wars have been fought over access to fresh water. List ways through which water use can be reduced. More efficient industrial systems and agricultural irrigation. You can grow crops suited to the area. You keep soil covered at all times with some sort of plant. GMOs that can tolerate drought and saltwater irrigation. A GMO is a genetically modified organism. We will be doing a debate centering around genetically modified organisms. Don't have, as a personal non-use, don't have lawns and ornamental plants. Just let whatever's supposed to grow there grow. Grow food instead in your front yard, or have a natural landscape. Low flow everything. Low flow toilets, low flow showers, low flow sprinklers. Xeriscaping. I'm going to talk about what that is in a second. Choose a different food as a consumer. Okay, look at how much water certain things use. My goodness, beef is a water suck. So in all the things that I've named, you've got some things like low flow toilets that help you use less water as an individual. And then you have things like the kind of food that you eat is kind of a secondary way for you to cut down on how much water you use. So think about this stuff. What are the benefits? You would need to know economic and environmental benefits to this on a national exam. Economic benefits for you: if you're using less water, you're paying for less water. This is especially true if you are a farmer, and if you're paying less for something that you're using because you're just using less of it, your profit goes up. You can see here this farmer in a third world country brings in water from a river in this barrel that she can push, and she puts it into this reservoir, and through gravity and these little drip pipes, she's able to grow a lot of crops with not a lot of water. She can sell those and make a tidy little profit. Environmentally, if you do things like grow a natural area instead of growing a lawn, you increase the biodiversity of wherever it is that you live, and you increase the number of plants and animals that are around. And the benefits to you are everything from the aesthetics of being around natural areas. It has been proven time again to improve the health of humans. And then also you have opportunities for genetic variation to occur, and you can do everything from find new food sources to find new sources of medicine that eventually do help you. Having natural plants, again, you use less water, so you have to spend less on there, less for yourself. Another environmental benefit to growing natural plants that are supposed to be there is it reduces things like soil erosion. All right, so Um, Describe 2 ways in which saltwater can be purified into fresh water. What are the drawbacks of using these methods to create fresh water? You have distillation, which is where you boil salt water and you collect the purified fresh water as steam. And then you have reverse osmosis, which is where you force water through a membrane that pushes fresh water through and leaves high salinity, what's called brine, behind. High salinity means there's lots of salt in it. Both methods use lots of fuel, create high salt brine waste, and lead to thermal pollution when the heated brine water, the waste that's left behind, it's also heated up, whether you're doing distillation or reverse osmosis, is sent back into whatever saltwater reservoir that you pulled it out of. Do also realize that the increased salinity is a killer, the heat is a killer, and there's also less dissolved oxygen in there. All of those things, when you pipe it back into where you got it from, although that seems like a good plan, it ends up killing anything that you that basically crosses through that water. Fish are very sensitive to things like salt levels and temperature levels, as well as the fact that there's no dissolved oxygen in there. So take a look at some of this. It costs $3 to $4 per 1,000 gallons. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it's definitely more expensive. Anybody who lives out on Sanibel Island knows this. They pay twice as much for their water out there as we do here on the mainland because they use reverse osmosis. Do realize that places like Saudi Arabia has the highest number of reverse osmosis plants, simply because, let's see if we go back to this map and you take a look at where Saudi Arabia is. It is literally bordered on all of its sides, well, on 3 of its 4 sides, by nothing but salt water. So it really doesn't have a choice to use distillation or reverse osmosis plants. If you know anything about Saudi Arabia, that is the world's largest reservoir of fossil fuels, of petroleum, and so they can pretty much afford to burn fuel to go ahead and do this stuff. All right. Here's the desalination process of reverse osmosis. You put salt water under high pressure. You've got what's called a semi-permeable membrane. That means only certain things can go through it. Salt water left behind here. Fresh water goes through. Here again, osmosis is where water flows from a high concentration to a low concentration. Reverse osmosis is where you force water to go from a low to a high concentration, and that's through the application of pressure. All right, problems with desalination. Costs a lot of money, lots of energy goes into it. If you're using fossil fuels, you're creating pollution. You've got to sterilize the water. That kills a lot of marine organisms, both in the water that you draw out, and then the sterilization process can also kill marine organisms when you discharge it. Again, the brine waste dumped back into the sea, it increases salinity of surrounding areas. That's a killer. Process also removes trace ions necessary to plant health. If you're using it for irrigation purposes, you would have to then add back in trace ions for the plants to stay healthy. The plants to do this, not growing plants, but like the industrial areas where you do desalination, they take up a huge amount of space. And then again, the discharge water is warmer than the surrounding area where you withdrew it, and that can kill fish as well. What is xeriscaping? It's where you use native drought-tolerant plants as ornamentals. Good for you as a consumer because you use less water to water them. Good for the ecosystem because the critters in your area are used to living in these plants, so they can continue living in these plants. Ornamental lawns, the way that we have them here in Southwest Florida, are basically biodiversity deserts. There's not a lot that can live in that grass. Unfortunately, most homeowners associations do not allow you to have xeriscaping. All right, what are some economic approaches to water conservation? You have, you can offer government subsidies for efficient water practices. So in other words, you can give people money prizes for doing a good job. Then you can tax and fine folks who do not conserve water very well. What are the concerns with privatizing water management? Because that's the whole thing is, what if, let's go ahead and give water to a corporation to run it. Corporations want a profit. That's a good thing, right? Well, except when everybody needs water for survival. Poor people are not going to get water because they're going to be priced right out of it. So there is a movie called Blue Gold that I may assign as an extra credit assignment to watch and answer a few questions. It really goes into areas where water has been privatized and what people have to do just to be able to get a drink of water, let alone water to cook with and to wash with. All right, and that is the end of Chapter 15, Part 2.